On January 30th, 1946, Minsk, the capital of Belarus, still stood among post-war ruins, and the frost had locked the ground solid. More than 100,000 people filled an open square, shoulder to shoulder, and they had come there on their own to watch. Into that frozen space rolled 14 military trucks, each carrying one condemned man upright on the flatbed with a noose already around his neck. Soviet soldiers had fixed the ropes before the convoy entered. Then nothing moved. The crowd fell silent for a moment, and only after that pause did the trucks pull forward and leave 14 bodies hanging in the winter air. Applause answered them. At the center of the case stood the chief defendant, a 55-year-old German general named Johann Georg Richert. The indictment placed 2 acts beside his name: ordering children onto minefields and leaving civilians behind barbed wire in an open swamp. That name entered the story first. After the applause, one thought remained. The survivors had finally seen this day. That moment closed the square. From there, the story turns back, away from the hanging, and toward the beginning of Johann Georg Richert's life. The trail leads back to 1890, to Silesian-Liebau, where Johann Georg Richert was born on April 14th. Today, the town is Lubawka in Poland. In the autumn of 1909, he entered the Imperial German Army, went through military school, and received his lieutenant's commission in March 1911. He was 20 years old. Long before Nazi rule, his file already held officer training, rank, and a clear path upward. War opened that path wider after July 28, 1914, when the First World War sent him to the front. Parade ground insignia gave way to trench mud. In the first year alone, Richert received both classes of the Iron Cross, and those decorations fixed his value inside the army well before Adolf Hitler reached power. By 1918, the war had turned against Germany. French troops captured Richert, and French captivity held him for 14 months. Captivity ended in 1919, and Richert stepped back into a defeated, humiliated Germany after French imprisonment. Veterans queued for bread. Parties fought in the streets. He did not leave the army. He kept his rank of Oberleutnant, the equivalent of a first lieutenant, and the army still offered him the one path upward that collapse had not closed. Then power shifted again. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took the state. Richert stayed put. The promotions kept coming. By mid-1938, he was already an Oberst, a full colonel. In February 1939, he received the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 11th Infantry Division. That new command left him only about 6 months before war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany sent the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 11th Infantry Division into Poland on the first day of the invasion, while Stuka sirens wailed over the advancing columns, and Warsaw capitulated on September 28th. Then the front turned west. In May 1940, German forces pushed through the Ardennes, went around the Maginot Line, and reached Paris in 6 weeks, occupying the city on June 14th. Richert fought in both campaigns. He received decorations for both. 2 fast victories taught the army to prize officers who kept pace, held command, and delivered results. By the end of the French campaign, Richert stood in the files as a decorated regimental commander the staff could send farther east. 3 million men. That was the Eastern assignment waiting beyond France. Before dawn on June 22, 1941, Germany opened Operation Barbarossa and pushed across a front almost 3,000 kilometers wide. Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Slovak, and Croatian units moved with them. Belarus came early. Nazi leaders had already defined this campaign in one clear line: conquest and annihilation together. One of the first territories they hit was the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic. German forces took Minsk within 7 days. The killing policy did not wait. That same week, genocide began. German authorities drove Jews into overcrowded ghettos, cut off food and medicine, and left people to starve. Minsk fell on June 28th, and in July, German authorities already sealed the Minsk ghetto. In Belarus, the first week of invasion already meant ghettos, hunger, and no medicine. By the roads, the earth in the ditches stayed wet after the shooting. Mass shootings began almost at once. Civilians were driven to roadside ditches and shot there, while nearby villages burned in the first weeks. Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory and killed entire communities as the occupation spread. In Belarus, about one-third of the pre-war population died under German rule, one of the war's highest civilian death rates. Richert arrived there with his regiment in the summer of 1941. Those months did not stall Richert's rise. By December 1941, he had earned the German Cross in Gold for battlefield performance. He was rewarded. In April 1942, the army promoted him to Major General. Then it gave him the 286th Security Division in the Orsha region of northern Belarus. Orsha sat on the Minsk-Smolensk rail line, a major junction behind the front. Rear units there guarded tracks, roads, and supply routes. On paper, security. In practice, security divisions treated villages as suspect, burned homes, shot hostages, and deported civilians under the label of anti-partisan warfare. Post-war testimony and Soviet investigation files said Richert encouraged those crimes instead of stopping them. One method stood out. Richert ordered civilians to walk, plow, or drag equipment across roads and paths suspected of mines. Women and children were among them. He spared his soldiers. Local people took the risk. People pulled a plow down the road, knowing the next step could trigger an explosion under their feet. In one case from the Orsha region, that order killed 28 people. 18 were children. That single road became a wider method. By late 1942, the 4-week anti-partisan Operation Forest Winter turned village suspicion into columns of numbers. Soviet records and post-war German records match. They list 1,627 Belarusian civilians killed and 2,041 deported for forced labor. German units moved through forests and villages, then left empty yards in the snow and cattle driven away. They also seized about 8,000 head of livestock and more than 167,000 meat rations. Those figures show the target clearly. The blow hit civilians and the food that kept villages alive. The word suspected did the rest. It could mean armed resistance or a family still in its house. Villages burned. Families with no tie to partisans were shot, deported, or stripped of food in winter. Richert signed the orders and checked the reports. The operation reports carried his orders and his initials. The paper trail now reached the ground. In March 1944, as Soviet forces pushed west and the Wehrmacht prepared to retreat from central Belarus, Richert received an order tied to General Joseph Harp and the Ninth Army. It was a camp for civilians the Germans no longer wanted to feed or keep. The first groups were the sick, the elderly, children too young for labor, and relatives of men already taken for forced work in Germany. This was not a rear camp with supplies. The site itself set the terms. The place lay near Ozerichi, about 140 kilometers southeast of Minsk. There were no buildings, no barracks, no roofs, no sanitation, no food stores. Only a huge fenced perimeter in open marshland, with barbed wire in the wind and wet snow underfoot. Richert's 35th Infantry Division, joined by Sonderkommando 7B of Einsatzgruppe B, swept through nearby villages and towns. Guards formed columns and drove them forward under escort. Children under 13, nursing mothers, the sick, and the old went the same way. Under guard, those columns passed the wire and entered the open marsh. The killings continued on the road to Ozerichi. Guards shot at least 500 people who collapsed or fell behind during the march. Bodies lined the route. After the war, Ninth Army messages surfaced, and those papers show commanders knew how many people were dying. The order stayed. They advised burial teams for later actions, so crews could remove corpses from the roadside. Inside the wire, prisoners could not even light a fire because smoke might expose German positions to the advancing Soviet forces. Guards also shot people who moved toward the fence in search of water. Larissa Stashkevich later described the place in plain words: a gate, barbed wire, watchtowers, soldiers, dogs, and nothing else. Her testimony matched the paperwork. To survive the cold, She pressed herself against the bodies of the dead. German correspondents counted those victims as useless mouths. In 1 week, at least 9,000 people died inside the camp. Months later, the war on that same ground was moving west. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union opened Operation Bagration, the war's most destructive single offensive. Within weeks, the Red Army destroyed 28 of Army Group Center's 34 divisions, and the Eastern Front collapsed. The officer who had driven civilians forward now lost his own line. Richert's 35th Infantry Division took heavy losses and fell back toward East Prussia. In the final weeks, Soviet forces encircled it near Gdansk. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and Johann Georg Richert laid down his arms before Soviet troops. Within months, Soviet investigators turned that surrender into a criminal case. In December 1945, the Minsk Military Tribunal opened with 18 defendants, and Richert became the lead defendant. The retreat was over. The case had reached a courtroom. On December 15th, he faced questioning from 9 in the evening until 2 in the morning. The session ran 5 hours. He cooperated. He admitted guilt, then said he had only followed orders and blamed his superiors. By the time the judges spoke, that night admission had become a formal verdict. In his final words, he denounced the Nazi regime before the court and asked for mercy. On January 29, 1946, the tribunal found him guilty on every count. 13 others joined him. 14 men received death sentences by hanging, and when the verdicts were read aloud, the courtroom rose and applauded. By the next morning, the sentence had moved out of the courtroom and onto the Minsk Hippodrome, the site of today's Victory Square. The verdict was now in the open center of the city. It was January 30th, 1946. More than 100,000 civilians came to watch. 14 military trucks entered the square one after another, one truck for each sentence. On the back of each vehicle stood a condemned man, the noose already around his neck. Soviet soldiers checked the ropes and made the last preparations while the crowd watched in silence. No one shouted. Some of the men stood rigid and tried to hold their composure for a few final minutes. Others lost control in full view of the square, just as eyewitnesses later described. Johann Georg Richert stood among them. He was 55 years old. No one in that crowd shed a tear for him. Richert had spent 36 years in uniform, through 2 world wars and the rise of Nazi rule across Europe. He had ordered civilians onto minefields. He had signed the deportation list for Osirichi. Those acts stood behind him on that truck more clearly than any defense he had offered in court. Then the trucks pulled away. The ropes tightened. More than 100,000 people stood in the January cold and watched the sentence turn into a public death. When it was over, the square remained silent. After that silence, there is nothing left to add. Stories like this stay on record for one reason. What people erase, they permit to return. The name fades, but the file remains. The square, the trucks, and the sentence stay in view as the screen goes black.